Okay, this is a relatively short lesson about the reasons for Soviet expansion and who, in the sort of ilk of who was to blame for the Cold War. So we're going to start this lesson off, and again, too, you're going to love me because this is going to take you much time. But the first thing you need to know is that in 1946, Sir Winston Churchill heads out on a speaking tour. You'll recall that he was replaced at the Potsdam Conference by Clement Attlee, a man whom Churchill said is a modest man with much to be modest about. Nevertheless, that modest man beats Churchill in a very surprise win in the British general election in 1945, and Churchill is effectively unemployed. Now, banking on his credentials as a wartime hero and a great speechmaker, he embarks on a worldwide speaking tour, and by worldwide meaning he goes to the United States, where they're willing to pay him a lot of money to listen to him speak. Now, Churchill, of course, if he, as a man of many talents, is a very controversial figure, but at the same time, too, one thing you can't deny about Churchill is his success as a statesman and his understanding of world politics. He ends up in Fulton, Missouri, and he gives a speech at the University of Missouri there, and where he basically calls for and says that an iron curtain has descended on the continent. And what does he mean by that? Well, it's a very interesting comment. Basically, he says that a shadow has fallen on Eastern Europe, which was now cut off from the free world by what is, quote-unquote, an iron curtain. Now, there's no iron curtain, but it's a sort of a metaphorical iron curtain. And he says, behind that line, he says, the people of Eastern Europe were subject to Soviet influence, totalitarian control, and police governments. From the Russian perspective, basically, they viewed Churchill's speech as a call for war on the USSR. In fact, Nikita Khrushchev, who will later become the sort of first chairman of the Communist Party and head of the Soviet Union, basically says that the Fulton speech urged imperialistic forces of the world to fight the Soviet Union, and that our relations with England, France, and the USSR were forever ruined after that speech. Now, make a long story short, all that is true. Bottom line is, what really resounds from the Iron Curtain speech is a realization in both the West and the East that a serious divide, that the once allies at Potsdam would never truly be allies again, and in fact they would be enemies. For a lot of people, this marked the beginning, really, of the concept of the Cold War in people's minds, and this would last roughly until the end of the Cold War in 1991, and the term Iron Curtain would be used very heavily. So, part of the falling of the Iron Curtain really depends on the concept of Soviet expansion here. We have a picture on the right of Joseph Stalin taking over lots of land as if he won it in a poker game between the Americans and the British. And the Soviet Union does expand. In fact, they end up in the countries that they occupied from the Nazis and never leave. And they do so for 5 very interesting reasons. Number one, the memory of what happened between 1918 and 1939 was very, very prescient. And the fact that the Soviet Union was the archenemy of the West ideologically and actually militarily, because of course the West and a lot of the countries had supported the white forces against the red forces in the Soviet and rather the Russian Civil War in an attempt to stop the Bolshevik and communist revolution. They were unsuccessful, but that memory really lasted in the heads of many of the Soviet leaders. Number two, something called the percentages deal, which I'll talk about. Third, the strategic importance of Poland. Fourth, a need for security. This is a country that had been attacked twice in just over 20 years by the Germans, and there were very legitimate security concerns that the Soviets had, and they needed to keep a firmer control on Eastern Europe to prevent that from happening again. Don't forget countries like Romania, for instance, fought alongside the Nazis. And lastly, there's naked expansionism. Stalin was an opportunist. He saw this and the end of the war as a time for the Soviets, perhaps, to step into the vacuum of control left by the retreating Nazis. So let's look at each one of those topics specifically. The first one is the memory of what happened between 1918 and 1939. Most European countries were hostile to the USSR between World War I and World War II. They're hostile in a number of ways, and I've often talked about so far The fact that some of them supported the opposition forces trying to reinstate the Tsar, trying to bring back the old way of Russian life after the Russian Revolution in 1917 during what was known as the Russian Civil War. Countries that directly had direct military involvement including USA, France, Great Britain, Canada, Australia to a small extent, Czechoslovakia. These countries obviously were very hostile and remained very much a concern of the Soviet Union. So they expanded in many ways, both to control countries like Czechoslovakia, but also to strengthen Russia against what they perceived as a world of enemies. Moreover, the Soviets were not permitted to trade or belong to international trade agreements. In fact, the Russian economy was entirely closed to Western markets. In fact, that very rarely changes up until the end of the 1930s. The Russians are completely shut out from international trade, which is a tremendously damaging impact on their economy, and that was done so on purpose to show the weakness of the Soviet system. And as a result, the Russians held a very long memory. They had suffered greatly, not only under Stalin, but due to things like starvation and famine. And this was in large part because there was no market for their goods. There was no flow of money in or out of Russia, and as such, their economy had a very hard time keeping up or succeeding. It's also important to note that two of the key linchpin countries in what the Soviets would occupy after World War II had fought with Germany against the USSR. I mentioned Romania earlier, but it's also important to note that Hungary had sided with the Nazis during World War II, and Hungarian troops were instrumental in many of the campaigns against the Russians on the Eastern Front, particularly in Army Group South in the Caucasus, if I want to be very specific. But now, anyhow, you get the idea that the Russians took a very, very long view of the relations with the rest of Europe, and they remembered exactly what the situation had been between 1918 and 1939. The second thing is what's known as the percentages deal, and this is a very controversial and interesting topic. Now, according to Stalin and according to Churchill, they had reached an agreement, an understanding, if you will, known as the percentages deal, something effectively scribbled on a piece of paper, as you can see from the picture of the percentages deal here on the right in Churchill's very own handwriting. Stalin effectively believed that in this percentages deal, which was the subject of an after-dinner conversation between Stalin and Churchill, was in fact tacit acceptance by Churchill and the West of USSR influence in Eastern Europe. Although the Soviet Union took 100% control of the Iron Curtain countries after the war, Stalin did keep his promise, interestingly enough, in the debates at Potsdam, to stay out of Greece and allow for sort of the UK-USA interest in Greece to be maintained. In fact, there's a very contentious issue that we'll learn about, the fact that Greece breaks out in a civil war, and the UK and the USA support the Greek monarchists against the communists, which are trying to take over Greece at that particular time. So the Russians don't get involved in that and keep up with the percentages deal. So in many ways, Stalin justified his occupation of Eastern Europe based on what was scribbled down on a piece of paper between him and Churchill. Lastly, or thirdly rather, is the strategic importance of Poland. You see a picture here of Warsaw. Poland was the in-between country. It was the way the Germans got to the Soviet Union. Poland was created at the end of World War I, and in many ways was a buffer country between the two powers that were disintegrated by the treaties that ended World War I, that of the Russian Empire and that of the German Empire. And Poland, which had been a country back in the Middle Ages, had not been a country for several hundred years, but after 1919 assumed its independence again. And you'll remember Poland is contentious over things such as the Danzig corridor, et cetera, et cetera. Stalin wanted to move the Polish frontier so that it became part of the USSR. He wanted a communist government in Poland so he could remain in control of Poland, so that he could also ensure that Germany, if it were ever to rejuvenate itself, was never in a position to attack Poland. Well, rather, attack through Poland the USSR. So Poland becomes a strategic barrier, and if you understand the fact that Poland is important in Stalin's paranoid vision that the Germans are going to attack him, you understand why why Stalin refused free elections at Potsdam and basically kept a communist government in control of Poland until the early 1990s. So in many ways, Poland gets wrapped up in the larger issue in the mind of Joseph Stalin, and that's of security. Of course, coming back to the concept that they'd been invaded twice, Stalin didn't need an excuse to be paranoid. This is a man, if you recall, that was responsible for estimates, some estimates, 35 million deaths of his own people. Many of them through what are known as the purges. The purges were the sort of removal of any potential threat, any person or group of people who were in the way of what Stalin viewed as progress, or solidifying Stalin's grip on power. Security, and maintaining not only security for Stalin, but security for the Soviet Union was paramount. And of course, again, the idea that they had been attacked twice in 25 years and under 25 years and suffered enormous losses. The Russians are the biggest, by far, loser in terms of casualties in the Second World War. The Soviets suffered incredible amounts of both civilian and military casualties. And he wanted a zone of friendly or Soviet-controlled states in Eastern Europe, again, as a buffer against future aggression. So, in other words, to prevent so many Russian citizens dying, he wanted any future war to be fought in the East if he were ever to be invaded. Therefore, the civilian populations who suffer are not that of the Russians. The last point is just naked expansionism. The USA, Britain, and France probably rightly believed that Stalin's motives were political. Stalin had wanted to expand his empire. His actions previous to 1945 very much demonstrated this. Okay, his seizure after the Russian Civil War, actually that's not necessarily Stalin, but the Russian seizure of a lot of the land in in Eastern Europe that was taken away from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, including areas of Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. But also, too, it's important to note that the Soviet Union once controlled Finland at the time of the Tsars. Stalin invades Finland in 1939 after getting assurances from the Germans that they won't invade in the Nazi-Soviet pact in an effort to try and reclaim Finland. He is an individual, and the Soviet Union is a country that is definitely expansionist. And it is right for the West to probably presuppose that the Soviet Union will keep those countries in an effort to expand. This is not sphere of influence. This is if we are going to be friends and you're basically going to follow your line. This is going to be influence and control. Okay? The Soviets denied almost every country, in fact every country that they occupied, free elections. They rigged elections to ensure that people voted for quote-unquote communist puppet governments. A puppet government, if you think of what a puppet is, it's controlled by a puppeteer who's out of the scenes. It would be the case that the Czechoslovakians, for instance, would have a government. However, that government would report directly to Moscow and be beholden to the instructions of the leader of the Soviet Union, that of Joseph Stalin. Therefore, Soviet expansion is a reason, and there is underneath all of the regional concerns, which are valid, a very real need/want amongst the Soviet leader to expand the Soviet Union and expand the influence of communism on Eastern Europe. There's no denying that. So those are the 5 reasons why the Soviets expand. Like I said, brief lesson, I hope you enjoyed, but an important one when we consider what happens and what the U.S. reaction to this is.